Okay. Hello. I think our hour has come. So if we could start. I'm Peter Bush and I'm moderating this session. I'd just briefly like to introduce the panelists. There's Anna Frankel from the Nordin agency based in Stockholm. Gabriela Page-Foster from the director of Amazon Crossing. Susan Harris, the co-founder and leading editor at the Words Without Borders, sorry. If only Worlds Without Borders as well. And Aubrey Botsford, a freelance literary translator. We're looking at kind of how to get started as a literary translator in the digital era. And we're not only going to look at how to get started, but we're also going to look at how to keep going once you've got started, which is equally important, I think. I remember that when I started, I was a pre-digital person, and my first translation was on a typewriter, and I was asked to do a sample for quartet books in London, and I sent it off by post, and I never heard anything for 3 months, whether they got my translation or not, and I eventually summoned up the courage to telephone the editor and say, well, did you like my translation or did it go straight into the bin? And he said, no, it's okay, we'll be sending you a contract out soon. You know, their publishers are very busy people and they're dealing with lots of books and you're only one of them. And then when I signed my contract, I found that they'd actually were doing it in partnership with North Point Press in San Francisco, and that my first translation was going to be edited by editors in San Francisco. And then my communication with my editors in San Francisco was by fax and occasionally by phone. And obviously things have dramatically changed since then. So I'm going to ask the panelists to kind of talk about their experiences. They're all coming at it from very different angles within the publication of literary translators, from their experiences of how people get started and how, where they are at, things have been changing over the last few years. So, Anne, would you like to start?
All right. Hi. Well, I'm coming from the literary agent perspective, and for us, it's very important with all the translators. Mainly since I work with Nordic authors, we work with translators that would translate from the Scandinavian languages into all different languages. Our main focus, what we look for, is translators that do Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish into English, because we use a lot of English samples in our work. And I usually meet with translators during the fair. Me and all of my colleagues from the agency try to meet with as many as possible. And it's super important for us because the translators always help us out with scouting as well. They have connections with different publishing agencies, publishers, and they know what they're looking for. So we have a lot of meetings with translators here, and then normally we try to scout them out on different translator websites, and usually we have like a Rolodex of all of our different translators. We try to keep up with them, we try to meet them as often as we can. But of course, nowadays most of our communication is by email. And I just try to keep up with what they're doing. There's a lovely booklet called Swedish Book Review that we use a lot for our meetings, where they do reviews of Swedish books, and they have samples in them. And this we can use when we're meeting with publishers during the fairs. And we always try to sort of put forward the translators that we meet. So for translators beginning, I would definitely try to contact the different agencies, go to their websites, try and get their number, and try to get in touch with one of the agents. Doing free samples always nice, because that's going to give us an idea of what kind of translations you're best at, things like that. So it's a super important thing, and it's always nice to be in touch in either way we can.
Gabriela.
As an editor for Amazon Crossing, I work with translators in a lot of capacities, of course. So I find books here at the book fair from agents like Anna and others. Sometimes they offer me a sample translation, and sometimes that sample translator is exactly the right person for the job. And so that's one way that I'll meet a new translator and sort of move forward. But I also find books that have never been translated and that I need to find the right translator for the project. So Amazon Crossing has a platform at translation.amazon.com where I actually post projects for translators in that language pair who are part of our platform to put forward proposals with a short snippet translation, which is a piece of the actual work that's to be translated, along with the schedule and fee and royalties that look appropriate for your schedule and for your workflow. And then I look at those proposals and choose the best translator for the project. And so generally that has a lot to do with voice and a lot to do with accuracy in the translation because, I personally read French and Spanish. So for those two languages, I can read against the original and make a very good assessment of, the quality of the translation from a number of different perspectives. And for the languages that I don't speak, I actually am reading the English snippets, looking for the thing that reads the best, that feels the most like a book that I wouldn't put down, and that feels like something I would give a 5-star rating to if I was a customer, or write a great review of in the press if I was a part of the media. And so that process allows me to really go beyond just the who do I know who translates from Danish, and a little bit deeper to say, who do I know that translates from Danish that understands this book and that hears this author's voice, and who can write in such a way in English that it will draw in potentially millions of readers to this author's work. So it's a great tool for me, and it's also, of course, therefore, a great tool for translators because it creates new relationships with editors and with authors beyond where you might have already been filed. And it also opens up the opportunity to say, oh, well, I've never considered using this translator for this type of book before, but boy, did her sample turn out wonderfully. I think this is exactly the right fit. And so it creates sort of a broader perspective on what each individual translator can do. And it also, of course, adds efficiencies because we have a lot of work to do, all of us, and the business part of translation is not any of our favorite part. You have to make a deal, you have to get the contract settled, and you have to get the schedule in place. But the fun part is working on the books and talking about the books. And so it sort of creates a vehicle to put our energy when we're talking to one another on the phone and writing emails and having all of the other correspondence onto the things that matter the most to us, and to allow the business aspects to sort of flow smoothly along.
I'm Susan Harris with wordswithoutborders.org. We're an online magazine of literature and translation. We publish monthly. I like Peter. I am was pre-digital when I started, and I actually started in book publishing in the mid-'80s. At which point, again, as Peter said, you conducted business by post. On occasion, you spoke on the phone, but it was so thumpingly expensive. And if you did speak on the phone, again, on your landline, in your office, if you called someone in Britain, even just getting through the pleasantries was $15. And of course, there would go your budget for the year. So we did everything by post. Then we gradually, again, as Peter mentioned, graduated to fax, which again was positively thrilling. The idea that I could send a message immediately and have it received immediately, and then perhaps get an answer back by the end of the day, was absolutely stunning. And of course, now that is quite a prehistoric pace. Working online now, obviously we're an online publication, and the majority of my communication is by email. I'm always rather startled if the phone rings, so it's actually going backward, and I have no telephone skills whatsoever anymore, although I understand that that's quite common among most people, not just in publishing. But obviously we do a lot by email, and of course the other thing that I think the technology has allowed us to work that much more quickly. Obviously, we publish everything online, and so we're editing online as well. We don't, we're not marking on paper. We're not using the post for anything. And just as having online access and living in this digital world gives us great access to translators, and gives translators access to us as well. Again, it enables us to be in touch with authors and with agents and other publishers. It's lovely to be at the book fair and meet people face to face and talk to people as opposed to being an email. But again, we do have primarily we are in touch by email, and I think so much more is possible now, certainly than when I started. When essentially you had to, again, you had to find people, you had to knock on people's doors, almost literally. So,
Aubrey?
I'm coming from the other end of the perspective, which is that I am an active translator. I'm in the fortunate position that I'm not trying to make a living from it. I have a day job, which allows me to pick and choose my projects. And that, since the topic of the day is finding new projects, I'll say that's never been a problem for me, finding a project. I mean, these are just a few of the projects that I have in mind of things I would like to do. Is there a problem with the sound? Somebody's gesticulating at the back. Can you hear me all right? I'll come a bit closer. Here we go. I've never had a problem finding projects. The difficulty, of course, is getting somebody else to agree that the project I want is a good project, and then putting it forward. And I think in this context, the digital area is a fantastic tool in the sense that it's much easier to do the research, to find opportunities. And I have to say, too, that the revolution in publishing that's been taking place in the last decade or 2 decades makes an enormous difference, too, because there are ways in which publishers can take risks on translations that they would not have taken a generation ago. They can do electronic publishing, obviously. They can change the model of the way a translator or an author earns royalties. There are all sorts of different ways of doing things which allow for some experimentation. From a translator's point of view, I think that's great. The other thing is that I'm not sure it has anything to do with the digital age, but there has been an explosion in interest in translated fiction in the last, especially fiction, in the last 10, 15 years, partly down to the Nordic arena and lots of very fantastic crime writers coming from that part of the world. So hard as it is to get a project off the ground and get a publisher interested in it, I think the opportunities are out there. And there are tools available. I don't know if you want me to go straight into that. I mean, in a very practical level, there are, you can of course use Google, clearly, but then there are platforms like Amazon Crossing, and there are other publishers that are following a similar model, that are creating a kind of arena in which translators can meet up with projects. There are all sorts of websites too that publicize the literature of other countries. German has been my specialization lately, and I'm thinking, for example, of the project of New Books in German, which I have found very helpful. It's a great website which puts together a lot of information about prizes and grants, and also has an interesting list of new works that have come out that have done very well in the German-speaking world. Access to information about publishers and the rights, and who's the person to contact about the rights to find out whether they're available. These are simple tools, but they're much more readily available than they once were. Then there are lots of informal networks, informal, like the Emerging Translators Network, which perhaps many of you are familiar with, I don't know. New Books in German has its own Emerging Translators program as well, which allows people to put forward short sample translations, and from those they make a selection and take them forward to a larger extract of translation, and take part in give the opportunity to participate in workshops and that kind of thing. There are all sorts of competitions out there, and it's much easier to submit things. Gone are the days of preparing 12 copies of a typescript and submitting them in a sealed envelope and all this kind of business. It's just a lot easier to do. I have not been doing this as long as perhaps Peter, so I'm not pre-digital when it comes to translation. When I first started, which is about 10 years ago, we were already corresponding by email. And I think the other thing that has changed is that it's possible for somebody like me based in London to be working easily with publishers in the US. As it happens, almost all the work I've done has been for American publishers rather than British ones. I'm not sure that would have been possible or as easy 20 years ago for a translator. And working with editors in the process of producing the book and going through the various drafts and revisions and so forth, it's extraordinary how much easier it is. Perhaps this isn't always such a great thing, but there's always there's an audit trail of everything you've done. You know, there's kind of every version, every discussion you can kind of go back to and say, well, you know, no, wait a minute, that's not what I said, and that kind of thing. I think that's all I can say for the moment. Thank you.
I was wondering, I mean, I'm often asked by young translators kind of, or older translators, or who want to become translators, older people who want to get a new start, a new career, you know, how to get started. And I say something that may seem very old-fashioned, but I say, well, is there a book that you really like, that you think ought to be out there in English? You know, write a couple of sides of A4, a report, and do a kind of short 5-page sample translation. Look at various publishers' websites and make sure that you're not sending a pastoral novel to a publisher, say like Serpent's Tail, who like urban gritty stuff, because it will just get not looked at, it will get rejected out of hand. And I mean, is that advice still valid in your experience? That and well, the other thing is to identify an individual at a particular publishers that you can write to, and that can be quite difficult sometimes with big publishers. And all of this would be possible is like pre-digital, really. But is any of that advice still useful? I mean, in your experience, I was wondering
Yes.
whether you could also say, I mean, give perhaps examples of translators that you've seen start and then kind of continue.
I can weigh in on that one. Actually, Aubrey brought me Mechthild Borman's Silence, which is a book that's about to be published by Amazon Crossing. We have some free copies if anybody wants to take a book home. So basically, I've had a few new translators who I discovered because they brought authors to me. And it's a great way to get started with a new author, and it's also a great way to get started with a new translator. And I've seen a few different translators go on from having their first project be something that they came and said, this is something I'm passionate about and that I did because I thought it would be fun, and then proceed to do other things together very well. I also have seen great results from translators who I've worked with and come to know, sort of just pitching me things offhand. So sometimes that level of preparation isn't even necessary. Sometimes a quick cup of coffee and a conversation at the book fair is the way that it gets through. And sometimes it's just a link to the book's detail page or to some review that says, did you hear about this yet? Because I haven't heard of everything yet. There's only so much that any of us would notice just in our own day-to-day lives. But for young translators, I definitely think it's interesting to start out by saying, you know, this is what I'm most interested in, and it also sort of tells people something about yourself. It's also great to accept something that seems crazy to you as a young translator and give it a try as another way to get started. So I think the Amazon Crossing platform, just to talk about my own little world, you know, we have a lot of different kinds of projects coming through. And it might not be books that you would necessarily pick for yourself to be passionate and focus on and say, this is the book that I most want to translate. But in the process of translating the snippet, you might discover that this is something that you really love. And like with most things, translation is something that you get better at with practice. And so getting started and trying things out and experimentation, I think actually has opened a lot of doors for translators I've worked with that they might not have tried otherwise. So that sort of can go in both directions.
And one thing, a piece of advice that I give translators is that you have to work on two sides. You have to work on what you do individually, and then you have to work as part of the community. So, for example, just as to be a successful writer, you have to read as widely as possible and to get a sense of what good writing is. To be a successful translator, you have to read very widely and be up to date with what's going on in your source language or languages. It is of no use to me if someone, or I shouldn't say no use, but it is not as useful for someone to come to me and say, I translate from X language, what do you need? Or what can I do? Do you have something for me? It's much more helpful for me to have someone come to me and say, I translate from this language, and this is what, as Peter said, this is what I'm interested in, this is what I'm really enthusiastic about. These are some trends that are going on. And aside from your own individual research, I think it's crucial that you become part of the community. Again, now that everything is online, as we've been mentioning, everyone is so much more accessible, which is sometimes not to one's advantage, but there are so many options and so many resources available online for young translators, the Emerging Translators Networks in the UK and in the US. Lots and lots of sites, again, with information about books, about meetups, about events. I think you have to be out in public and meet people and really be part of the general translation community, as well as specializing in your own source language or languages.
And from the agent's perspective, I would say it definitely goes for us as well. And one of the good points about going straight to an agency is that you don't really have to take care of knowing who likes what, because if you go to our website, you will find all of our books, all of our authors, and then if any of those books are interesting to you or would be something that you would be interested in translating, you can contact us directly, and of course there will definitely be an interest for us to look at any type of sample and speak to you or talk to you via email, because we're always interested of having ambassadors out there who can talk about our books, except for, I always do that, but I love having other people read the authors that I represent, and talking to publishers, talking to their fellow translators, and people in the entire literary community. There's always a point of having people talk about something, talk about a project, and that's how I meet new translators when they contact me and say, I love this book, I would love to translate it to German or French or English, which usually is what we use mostly, but it's always nice. And then when I pitch the book to my publishers, I would tell them, and I also have a translator who has either done a sample or who would be interested in doing this, and that can really be a good help for them when considering a project, because it wouldn't have to, it takes time to get in touch with translators, finding the ones that you like, and if you already have a recommendation, it will be easier to move forward quickly. And I know, there's lines of the best translators, they're always super, super busy because people know about them and they don't know about their fellow translators, or they haven't tried anyone out, which means that books sometimes get delayed because the translators have so much to do that they can't take on new projects. So we're always interested if somebody would come to us and say that they have a project from our list that they would be interested in looking at. And I think that would go for all different agencies. I'm speaking from the Nordic perspective, of course, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happens in the US, UK, or any country around the world.
And I'd also mention that before you fall in love with a book and decide that you want to translate it, for heaven's sakes, do make sure that the rights are still available, because it's absolutely heartbreaking to really connect with a book and want to translate it and pitch it to somebody and be told, well, no, those rights have already been sold. That's something else that is very, very easy. In general, it is fairly easy to ascertain whether rights are in fact available simply by getting in touch with publishers.
Yeah, I would second everything that's been said, but I'd add that community, and there's a lot of sort of collaborative publishing going on now. I would cite something like And Other Stories, the publisher, which does a lot of sort of crowdsourcing and quite developing readers groups and things like that. But I would add to this, from the translator's perspective, it's very helpful if you can identify some funding for your project. And for that, there are not very many, but a few really good sources of grants and awards and things like that. And those are quite a tasty little thing to dangle in front of a publisher, to say, actually, I can bring some money with this. And the best example I can think of is the Hahn Translation Awards, which are based in the US. And I have a little personal knowledge of this. My sister got an award for one of these. and other stories picked up the book that she had nominated, and it went ahead and it was published. So I would encourage anybody who's setting out to propose projects to use every tool available to find financing. The other side of that coin is that sometimes, if you really are passionate about a particular project, sometimes it's worth going out on a limb and taking a bit of a risk yourself, and saying to a publisher, I would be willing to do this, in return for royalties only, if the thing is successful, rather than insisting on getting paid up front. Now, I realize that isn't always possible or practical, but there may be times when that's the best approach, and some publishers will work very well with that approach, others not. Amazon has a rather nice blend of paying a fee and paying royalties, which is good. Has a very large corporation behind it, which of course helps. But many of the best projects in translation that are taking place these days are with sort of smaller, more independent publishers, and I think they don't have those same resources, and it's worth being creative about how you approach funding. Thanks. Yeah.
I think that it's very important to kind of establish a CV. And one way to establish a CV is to not only to get your first book, but to begin to place, say, short stories or excerpts from novels or a small selection of poems on an online magazine. Is it the Quarterly Conversation? I think there's one called in the States, or there's the Massachusetts Review is very open to literary translation, and if you can get a few kind of short publications in key online magazines or in print magazines, then this helps to give a potential publisher the idea that you're serious about establishing yourself as a literary translator. And I was wondering whether you could say something about that, but also about kind of the issue of cash flow and going from your first book to kind of establishing yourself as I'm a full-time freelance translator, and I've been at it for quite a long time, far too long really, and for me it's an issue of how do you kind of pay the bills at the end of the month still, and I was wondering whether you have come across issues with your translators or about helping them to kind of have a continuous cash flow. I mean, one example might be the issue of contracts. The standard thing used to be in the UK, 50% when you've signed a contract and 50% when you deliver. I mean, there may be variations on that could help the cash flow. I don't know.
For the Amazon crossing payment model, we actually we pay 50% upfront and 50% on delivery for the fee, and our royalty rate starts with the first sale. So our hope is that the translators we're working with regularly will see cash flow from their royalties, and as you've done 2 books and 3 books and 6 books, the income is actually going to help level out and show a consistent line regardless of what new work you're doing. And the hope is that if you're clever about picking projects, you'll end up with some big spikes that help you to have a little bit more luxury and flexibility in how you plan your next projects. And then we're also always working to find translators who we can sort of partner with long term and say, okay, well, I have 8 books on my calendar in your language pair. What's your calendar like? Let's get aligned and find a way to work together in such a way that you don't have to sort of interrupt your literary translation to do something different.
We mostly do samples. We sometimes do translations of full manuscripts, which means that the cash flow is, of course, we don't pay as much. It's not as costly for us doing just the short samples, meaning that we usually pay when the sample has been turned in. It's never been a problem. Nobody's ever asked for payment up front, as far as I know. And then what usually happens if a book is picked up one of the books that we did a sample for, we try to have in our contracts to put forward the translator that did that sample. I mean, we can never decide for the publishers that we sell the books, we can never decide that they have to use the same translators, but usually it works out that way. And then the contract is signed between the translator and the publishing house. And that's always different. Sometimes it's just an upfront payment. Sometimes it's upfront and royalties. So they do various different kind of payment methods, which is usually just negotiated between the translator and the publishing house directly, not involving me as much. We don't pay royalties. We only do just one-time fees. It's usually based on word count, quite normal. Yeah.
And speaking of cash flow, at the magazine we have our own concerns, and as a result, we pay on publication. We generally are not acquiring our content so terribly far in advance, and we are doing obviously only short pieces, so we're not talking about an enormous book length fee. It is unfortunate, I know, and it's not fair. I wish that we could pay on delivery, but we do pay on publication, and we try to do that as quickly as possible in the month. We are very small, and so it depends on our workload, and I am using the royal we here, of course, but. And I do appreciate very much that translators are constantly very conscious of cash flow, and we do try to facilitate that where we can.
I think a good point has been made that cash flow is a problem not only for translators but also for publishers. Some of them are huge and it's not an issue, but small ones, definitely it's an issue. And one has to, I think, as a translator, one has to just accept that as a reality and respect it. I'm comfortable with the 50% upfront, 50% on delivery model, but as I said, I'm lucky enough to have a regular salary, so that's a bit different. What I think may change a little bit over time with the digital change to digital publishing, maybe a change in the way royalties are calculated. I think it's likely, I think it's desirable that royalties for both authors and translators should increase a bit as some of the costs for publishers go down. They may not. That's going to be something that authors, translators, and so on will have to negotiate and be realistic about. My own experience starting out, to go back to the question of getting a CV together, which I think, as Peter rightly says, is absolutely crucial, is that you have to be willing to do a little bit of work on your own account, short work ideally, but get it into the right places, so that when you approach a publisher with a real project, you can demonstrate that you deliver, that you're capable, that you can meet a deadline. These things are boring but important. If you can demonstrate that you've done those things, I think that's helpful to all concerned. Another area to look at, and it's, I think, related, is translation prizes. There are things like in this country, the John Dryden Translation Prize, where you can do a relatively short translation of an extract or some poetry or something like that. And if you are able to get a prize out of it, first of all, that's a bit of money, but the main thing is that it's a bit of exposure, and it's something you can put on your CV. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's worth trying. And if you enjoy the task of translating, and if it's something that you really feel inspired by and love, why not? You don't have to devote weeks and months and years to it. I think one of the problems with the 50% upfront, 50% on delivery model for a book is that there's quite a long time between those two things. It's months, if not in some cases perhaps longer. Whereas a short essay or 3 or 4 poems, it's not so long. Thank you.
And I'd say also, just as I suggested, you must read very widely in your source language. You also need to also need to familiarize yourself with where you're sending your things and not to waste your time by, say, if you are deciding to translate a short story or an essay or some poetry, not waste your time by submitting it somewhere that is not likely to accept it, as a journal that does not that's not interested in lit and translation, although there aren't that many, I think, or a journal that does not accept general submissions. Again, you need to familiarize yourself with. You need to familiarize yourself with every aspect of the field and every part of what you're trying to be part of.
Yeah, I think I was there was a meeting of translators yesterday at the Translators Association in terms of picking up things at community, and I was talking about this issue of contracts with several colleagues, and they were saying that now it's becoming more common for translators to sign contracts in which they get a flat fee. In other words, your advance is not an advance on royalties, but it is a flat fee. But they have a royalty in their contract which kind of kicks in when, say, a book has sold 5,000 copies. And I think that's a very interesting kind of development in contracts for literary translators. I was also going to say that there is also a way of getting started or a way of getting work which has to do with translations that are not published. Agencies in every country are trying to get their authors off the ground in the English-speaking world, and they often are wanting to have even whole works translated in advance to sell this the product, as it were. And it may be worthwhile to identify key literary agencies in the country whose language you are translating, and put yourself in contact with them and say, I am a translator of, say, Swedish or Finnish or Chinese or whatever, and if you have any work of this nature, then please do contact me. I have time. And often agencies are in a big rush to get these things done, and they can't find the usual translators that they use, and they have to kind of spread their net. And it's often done by word of mouth, which is another good reason for networking. But it may be, useful to take initiatives of this kind in relation to agencies yourself, because agencies also, another thing that one can sometimes do is agencies have books which film producers are interested in. So they want a translation of a book to take to film producers. And sometimes they may need the translation done in 5 weeks. Now, if they want the translation done in 5 weeks, it means that a lot of translators can't do it because they don't have a space in their timetable. But if you are somebody who, you're starting and you don't have a kind of whole year's work ahead, this is something that you may be able to kind of grasp. And if they want it in 5 weeks, you can put up your fee. I don't know if you have any experience of, well, you obviously, you're kind of working like that all the time.
Yeah. Well, again, that is one of our main focuses, and something that we love trying to find new translators all the time. So anytime somebody contacts us telling us they have a book from our list that they like, and that they would like to submit like a German translation or a sample translation of that. Specifically, of course, we're always looking for English, because English is so varied. There's so many that can read it. And those samples that we do commission, they might be everything from 30 pages from a book. It could be 10 pages from the beginning, 10 pages in the middle, and then the end. It varies a lot. We also do full translations sometimes, not as often as could be. I think the future will see many more full translations from agencies, because it's so important getting the word out there. There's so much competition in the translating business now. For us agents putting our books forward, there's so many books, and as you probably know from the Nordic countries, we have to stand out. And one way of standing out is by using sample translations. And I always like to have, if possible, if I have an English sample, but I also have a German sample, this again can be something that will help me pitch to German publishing houses. So there's always a point of contacting agents. when you translate from the language they're working from to English specifically. I mean, I would go French to English, not for me, but for a French agency, or Swedish, Danish, Norwegian for me. That would be really, really helpful, somebody translating into English, showing samples or just contacting me saying that they have a book from my list that they like. And again, that would take out the need for you, the translator, having to know a specific taste of a publisher, which can sometimes be difficult. I mean, you would know that if I have something on my list, I'm already interested in it.
There's one thing we haven't mentioned, which is it's probably on the agenda at some other time in the centre, but is the mentoring scheme run by the BCLT and the TA, I think, which is something to kind of approach and trying to get involved in if you can as a new translator. But there are also kind of all informal kind of mentoring setups, which is why it's so important to join the Translators Association or and go to meetings. Get to know other translators, because often translators who are very busy, they get projects offered to them, and then they can, offer them on to other people, suggest other translators, or sometimes suggest to other translators that they do something in collaboration. And as a young translator, then it's kind of, well, both for the younger translator and the more experienced translator, it's always a fascinating kind of thing to collaborate in the translation of a work, and it is certainly another way of kind of strengthening your CV and kind of widening your breadth of work. Should we open up some questions? I don't know, we've got 20 minutes, we could now kind of open up for questions, really.
I just can you hear me? Because I can't hear myself. No. Okay. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. I'm just wondering. I'm a perfectionist, and I work from German to English. If I'm pitching to an agent or a publisher, my preference would be to write in English, although I'm able to write in German because I'm less likely to make a mistake. Would that be frowned upon if you had an email from somebody saying, "Oh, I translate from German to English," but it's actually written in English?
For me, that wouldn't be a problem at all. I find that if I get in touch with a translator, or a translator gets in touch with me writing in English but saying that they do Swedish to English, I think it's good to have the conversations in the language that they want to translate into, because that will give me an idea of how good they are at writing English. And I mean, it's really important for all the books that the narrative, again, as what Gabriella was saying, is that it's the tone of the book, not necessarily that each word is correct. And if I find that a translator has a grip of a language, the language that they want to translate into, that can really be helpful, knowing what kind of style they have. So I wouldn't mind at all, and that happens all the time for us. And Swedish, of course, is a very difficult language, but sometimes we get in touch with translators that do Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian, and they might be Norwegian speakers, but they can still translate from Swedish to English, and I would rather have a conversation in English with them than them writing to me in Norwegian, me writing in Swedish, and then we're talking about something English. So not a problem at all.
And foreign rights agents at all of the world's publishers do most of their business in English. So if you're just sending a foreign rights inquiry, they'll be expecting it likely to be in English.
I have a question about foreign rights with online journals. Can you hear me?
Not too well.
I had a question. I wanted to submit a passage from I translate from French from a novel for an online journal for publication in the online journal. And when I inquired with the French publishers about the rights, they were rather indignant at the idea that only a section of their novel was going to be proposed for publication, that they felt this novel would have a good chance of, actually being sold as a publication. So I dropped it, and I wondered if that was a common experience. I mean, if you approach a French publisher and ask about the rights, they're very, very happy to know that you may be trying to market their book for them essentially in English, but they didn't seem to, in this case, they weren't interested in the idea of an online journal.
It varies by publisher. I think it's very short-sighted of publishers to resist publication of novel excerpts, particularly in online publications, because that is an excellent way for publishers who don't read the original language to get a sense of the novel and to see if they might be interested. And I know that at this point, I think 20 books have been published in English as a result of excerpts having appeared in our pages. And I think, again, it does vary by publisher. Some are not interested in selling rights, and others feel that publishing an excerpt online reduces the chances of a book being picked up for entire publication, which I think is rubbish. But again, it does depend on the publisher.
Yep.
I just wondered if you had any experience of translators buying the rights themselves to a book that they wanted to publish. This was suggested to me by a publisher, actually.
A publisher suggested that you buy the rights?
Yeah, not to a book that they owned, but that they said, well, why? I was talking about a book that I really liked, and they said, well, why don't you buy the rights yourself? It wouldn't cost very much. No?
There are a few good examples of that kind of collaboration being self-published, so it's not completely crazy, but it would definitely require you and the author to have a strong partnership for what the plan would be once you have those rights to publish.
I've never heard of that. No.
Hi, can you hear me? Aubrey, I think you mentioned it, but I think you've all mentioned it at some point about your CV, getting your CV organized. I've had some modest success with online magazines getting published there. Aubrey, you said specifically the point is to try and get your short story, whatever it is, published in the right place. Yes. And I think you mentioned, Peter, the Massachusetts Review. I was just wondering if any of you could mention some online articles what you would say, what you would consider be the right place, or somewhere would be, a suggestion of where your short story could be published. That was the
Words
one question.
Without Borders is a great...
Yeah, sure. Apart from Words Without Borders, yeah.
Also, Asymptote is an excellent online
Yes.
journal of literature translation. Asymptote.
Asymptote, yeah.
I mean, if you do noir, the Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, which is a magazine that's been going for kind of over 50 years, I think, in the States, and it still comes out with very cheap paper and so on, but it has leading writers.
Sorry, could you repeat the name?
The Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine. Ellery, thank you. Ellery, and they will pay you a fee, and it has good distribution in the States. It's kind of highly prestigious, but it doesn't look very, the kind of production values aren't wonderful, but it's got kind of real prestige, and they're interested in new stuff, and you can approach them and say, I mean, you can try the New Yorker. The New Yorker has it online. You can. Nothing to stop you if you have a story that you think the New Yorker might be interested. Well, you can have a go.
And again, I think a lot of literary magazines, certainly in the U.S., are looking simply for good writing, and they are not actively seeking translation, but they are not necessarily opposed to considering it.
And for those translating from Scandinavian to English, Swedish Book Review. That's I think it's the main magazine for reviews and samples. So that would definitely be something. And they're working together with the Swedish English literary translators. So it's an organization. So that's definitely something I would try for the ones writing in the Nordic languages to English.
Thanks very much.
And in Spanish, there's new books, new Spanish books, and then there's new Catalan writing. New Catalan writing are excerpts, and the new Spanish books, they're always looking for people to write reports. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question about the way agencies work. I'm not really familiar with the structure where it's not a particular writer that is being represented by an agency, but an agency that represents a whole cluster of languages, if I got that right. When it comes to minor languages in particular, how do I go about finding an agency that represents Polish writers, for instance?
I mean, it's the reason. One of the reasons why we represent a cluster of languages is because the Nordic languages are so similar, meaning that I don't speak Danish or Norwegian, but I can read it and I can communicate. But I always, if I have a meeting with a Danish publisher or a translator who translates from Danish, I would speak Swedish and they would speak Danish to me, and we would understand each other quite well because there's so much similarities. And that's really the reason why we are able to represent authors from the different languages. For instance, we don't have any Finnish authors because Finnish is so different from Swedish, Danish and Norwegian. And the same goes, of course, for Icelandic, which is also quite different. So, I mean, if you wanted to translate from Polish, then I would try a Polish agency.
But in Poland?
Sorry?
Do you mean in Poland?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
But I mean, there is always the possibility of, I know there are some Spanish agencies that do Spanish and Swedish. So they have authors that are Spanish, they have authors that are Swedish, they have authors that are Italian. So it's really, I would probably just try and look online at all the different agencies working in countries that you translate for the language that you translate from, and try to find out more about the agents working there, because usually that's what sets the tone. So if you have an agent who speaks Swedish and French living in Barcelona, the chance of that agent representing French, Swedish and Spanish authors is a lot larger, because they would know all of those languages themselves and be able to work with that source material.
A lot of countries have councils that are government funded that would be a good hub to start from too, to help sort of, yeah. When you ask that question, sometimes they'll actually point you in the right direction. That's one of my great sources for meeting new agents too.
Somebody over here.
So Words Without Borders has a terrific track record of identifying new literatures and being very prehensile in finding and reaching new literatures. So where are you looking?
At this point, we are looking to fill in some of the gaps. I have a world map on my wall, and I have push pins where basically that's the war room, and we have push pins of where we're published, and we are short of push pins in Africa. We're very weak on the non-colonial African languages. That's a big push for me at this point. If there's anyone in the audience who does translate from again, non-colonial African languages, please, I am eager to speak with you. We're improving our coverage of Asia, which was another area that we were somewhat weak in. We're good in Europe, we're good in South America, we're good pretty much elsewhere, but those are the two that we're looking at now.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. I am currently a translation major student, and I do English and Chinese translation. And for a student who is passionate about translation and also willing to enter this field, do you have any suggestions as to how can I prepare myself into this field? Because it sometimes values experience. And
I would definitely suggest that you try and speak with the different agencies that exist in Asia, the Chinese agencies, because they since for us we have trouble with the Asian languages. So you usually work together with co-agents, meaning that the agents in a specific country would represent our books to their market. And they usually, they usually are always looking for translators that can translate from English to Chinese or Japanese. And I've noticed that many Asian publishers want to translate from an English, even though the book may be written in Swedish from the beginning, they want to translate from English and then into their specific Asian language because it's easier for them in editing. So then again, you have to talk to the translator, the original Swedish to English translator. I would definitely try to get in touch with those people as well because you would be translating from their material, meaning that you would have to maybe negotiate a fee together with them as well, seeing as they have done it's kind of a cross-pollination in that way. So I would contact all the different agencies that they have, and I would also try and talk to my colleagues that do translations from various languages into English, try to talk to them and see if they have any books that need to be translated into your language, because that can really be a help.
Okay. No more questions? Fine. Well,
I think that's...
Oh, there is. Yeah, one at the back there.
Thanks. I wonder whether the panelists could reflect on the rise of the full book-length sample translation. You talked about normal samples, but what about full-length books?
If it's great, it might get published.
Seems to be a very common phenomena in the Nordics.
It's more common now than it was when I started out, but that's because there's so much competition within the Nordic countries of getting your books translated into any language nowadays, but specifically US and English. One of the reasons why full-length book translations are more common is because the Scandinavian languages, very few people speak them. We're not a large population in any of the countries where we have authors. And so it's difficult for the publishers in the countries where I want to sell. It's difficult for them to find readers. So if I translate or I commission a full translation, then it will be easier for them to get the full idea of the book. And because translations are so competitive nowadays and books are selling, some books are selling a lot, but some books aren't selling as much, meaning that the publishers might be a bit hesitant in buying the rights from me, and they will want to know that the book isn't good. The first 30 pages aren't just good, and then the book just falls flat. So that's why it's becoming more and more necessary. But of course, it's a big cost for both the agency, sometimes also the author. And it's also a cost for the publishing house if they want to buy a translation. So it's something that we have to consider all the time for our authors doing samples or doing just doing the full manuscript. And it's so difficult getting the right translator, finding the right tone for the entire novel, and not. It means a lot of editing as well for the agents, so that you have to factor that in as well.
Anybody else on that? I've never had to do it. Certainly in Spain, the agencies now over the last 3 or 4 years have begun to contract translators to do full book samples. That's something new in Spain. And I think they tend to do it with books that they really think are going to make it. And that's part of their kind of global kind of marketing strategy to have that translation already there to show to people agents throughout the world, publishers throughout the world. Okay, well, thank you very much to the panel, Anna, Gabriella, Susan, and Aubrey. Very kind of very great insights into how to get started in the post-digital. No, we're not post-digital yet. In the digital age. Thank you.